viewers, I am so glad that you get to witness my existential crises in real time, because, oh man. So I thought this video was going to be like a relatively easy one to research after the evolution video, throw this one together pretty quickly, tie up some loose ends, but I was having a hard time focusing on the topic, so then I decided to watch a documentary, and that led me down a bit of a scientific rabbit hole, which then led me down another scientific rabbit hole. And then I discovered that almost everything that I have ever learned about genetics, evolution, and more or less eugenics or anything else in life has been mostly incorrect. I do obviously have to give some trigger warnings for eugenics, COVID, Nazis, sterilization, mercy killings, all that good stuff, but if eugenics is really difficult for you, a solid portion of this video is just science stuff, so please stick around for that. Also, I will say that the sad eugenics stuff is an important part of our mostly untold history, so if you do have these spoons to spend, I would love if you could watch this whole thing from start to finish. The plan for today is to go through what the history of eugenics is, how it came to be, and what it led society to believe. Then we are going to turn literally everything onto its head by talking about the science of what genes actually are. Spoiler alert, scientists aren't actually very sure. And then we're going to follow that up with a discussion about what eugenics looks like today. And of course, we're going to talk about Temple Grandin and the CDC director's comments from 2 weeks ago, as well as how the pandemic as a whole has been handled. And lastly, we are going to close with a bit of a hopeful note to the best of my ability, talking about what you can do to try and help solve these issues and value all lives equally. So, it's probably going to be a long one. I think we can just accept the fact that I'm doing a lot more deep dive content now, and it's probably going to generally be a bit long, and I will try my best to stop apologizing for trying to see every absolute possible angle of an argument and therefore needing to explain so many things. So, to begin, let us examine the word eugenics. It was coined by Francis Galton, a cousin of our friend Charles Darwin in the late 1800s/early 1900s. He also created the idea of nature versus nurture and social Darwinism. Eugenics is kind of like taking social Darwinism and putting it into action. So let's talk about that phrase first. Since it ends in an ism, we know that it is a theory or a belief, and it's the idea that humans are subject to the same natural selection laws as all other animals, and therefore certain humans are less evolved and that, survival of the fittest stuff. It is no coincidence that this idea came about when European imperialism of the African continent began. The word eugenics is derived from two Greek words meaning well and born, and it has often been described as the scientific solution for social problems. Which is a yikes of a sentence, if you ask me. But whatever. The general Google definition is a practice that is aimed at improving the genetic composition of the human race. It promotes selectively mating people with specific desirable hereditary traits to reduce human suffering by breeding out disease, disabilities, and so-called undesirable characteristics from the human population. When we think about eugenics, we often think of Hitler, the Nazis, and the Third Reich, which makes sense, because in Nazi Germany there's this idea of lebensunwertes Leben, or life unworthy of life, and that led up to 300,000 or so deaths of disabled people in Action T4 of the Nazi euthanasia program for disabled people during World War II. And they believed that they were cleaning their race by ridding the world of these people. So eugenics was a Nazi thing, right? Well, turns out Hitler got all of his ideas and the model for his legalizations from United States legislation, so that's good. In fact, he was friends with Harry Laughlin, the superintendent of the American Eugenics Record Office, who was actually openly jealous of how well Hitler was doing with his eugenics program and wanted to bring it to America. So, yeah, eugenics kind of started here. Obviously, many people, for centuries, believed that pretty people should mate and have pretty children, or that smart people should have kids together, or that disabled people shouldn't have children, etc., etc. The difference here is that rather than just being like a personal opinion and a theory, these ideas became law in the early 1900s. Some examples of famous eugenicists include the famed journalist Jack London, Margaret Sanger, who was a major birth control advocate and is kind of the reason we have birth control today. She was also really close with the KKK, so that's a thing. Teddy Roosevelt, W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that only a tenth of the black race was good enough to continue to breed in order to be any hope for the race for the future. Henry Ford, the car dude who created the idea of an assembly line. Helen Keller, believe it or not, who firmly believed that children with learning disabilities should just be left in the woods to die. She was She was quite an interesting lady. Jessica Kellgren-Fozard has a lovely video about her that you can check out at the link in the description. And Alexander Graham Bell, who's gonna get a very brief info dump because I spent like a month studying this guy a couple years back, and so I need to put this knowledge somewhere or I'm just going to explode. So, Alexander Graham Bell is widely known as the dude who invented the telephone. And while that is true, he's actually a guy that invented the telephone. He's not the first person to invent it, and he beat a woman inventor to the patent office basically by 10 minutes. So now we know his name because, well, he got the patent first. Also, he was creating the telephone because he was trying to invent some sort of way to make deaf people hear again. He was fluent in sign language and supposedly a very beautiful signer, as both of his wife and his mother were deaf, but he was very against the use of the language at all and wanted to eliminate deafness entirely as well as deaf people. He wrote I guess you could call it a book. It's called Memoir Upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race, and basically he studied deaf families on Martha's Vineyard, completely fudged all of his data to reflect his own opinions, and then the National Academy of Sciences published it. The thing is public domain at this point. You can Google it, you can find a PDF. It's fascinatingly aggravating to read. I won't recommend it. I won't not recommend it. Do with that what you will. If you want to rant, let me know. We can talk. Anyway, he founded the American Association to promote the teaching of speech to the deaf at the same time that he was also the honorary president of the Second International Congress of Eugenics. So, yeah, anyway, that association is now known as the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. They actively work to support the oralist movement, which is the deaf people should never speak sign language because it's a bad language and they should only speak and lip read because then they'll be useful to society movement. And they're removing sign language from schools and they've been doing it since the 1800s. It's great. If you choose to work in the deaf community at all and you see Alexander Graham Bell's name on something anywhere, just run in the opposite direction as fast as you possibly can. All right, now that we're familiar with some old-timey eugenicist people, let's talk about a dude named Charles Davenport. Well, actually, let's see what the political climate was first, then we'll talk about Davenport. So, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of eugenics became a prominent thing in the early 1900s, and the question is, well, why? Let's look at the social climate of the time. This was the Gilded Age, where there was no middle class. It was just the very, very rich and the everybody else, almost like now. It's weird. Then all of a sudden, immigrants began pouring into cities, factories were being built, people were striking for better treatment, and there was a lot of motion going on in society. So in the mind of one of those fancy rich people, they'd look at this and go, society's deteriorating and there are degenerates everywhere, ugh, and they would clutch their pearls as they just dramatically, you know? Hence the desire for science to prove to them that yes, these people are in fact less than, they're less evolved, they're fundamentally different from us, and they should not continue their kind because we are superior. Because that's how people cope with change, apparently. Oh, and I might mention that eugenicist research was funded by, let's name drop some people, the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Harriman Foundation, and the Kellogg Foundation. So that's really fun. But anyway, back to Davenport. So he met with Mr. Galton, who was the Darwin cousin friend from earlier that we talked about. Great, cool. And he really liked his ideas, and so he consulted his friend, who is a psychologist by the name of Henry Goddard. Henry Goddard was the director of research at the Vineland Training School for Feeble-Minded Girls and Boys in New Jersey, which was the first known laboratory established to study intellectual disability. And he found that his students' family trees were rife with feeble-mindedness and alcoholism and prostitution and all of those things. So he concluded that feeble-mindedness is 2/3 the problem of humanity, and believed that you can't always see if somebody is feeble-minded, only an expert can truly tell, so these kind of people are just everywhere, and it takes just one breeding into your bloodline to completely mess up the whole line permanently. So he created the intelligence quotient, or the IQ test, to measure a person's level of feeble-mindedness and classify them as a moron, an imbecile, or an idiot depending on how low their score was. Yay. He believed that these people should be institutionalized, sterilized, and or both. Now, Davenport was actually very interested by this, and he wanted to learn more, so he decided to establish the Eugenics Record Office, and he made his friend Harry Laughlin the superintendent of that office. I hope you remember him from earlier, and if you remember any of the bland white dude names from this entire video, please remember Harry Laughlin. He's gonna come up a lot, and he's an important part of American history. So, the Record Office made a program where they would train recent college graduates and then send them out all over the country to gather data on people's family trees and bring it back to fill up the records office. And it wasn't like, hey person in a field, is your mom disabled? What about your dad? It was more of a, oh, I heard that her mom's an alcoholic, and they went, great, that is scientific fact, and then wrote it down on their clipboards and brought it back to the office. I hope that you're noticing all of the red flags on like the setup of this experiment. It's really just not scientific. The red flags should be very obvious to you at this point. So anyway, Laughlin was actually quite good at his job in the sense of record keeping and publicity. That doesn't mean that it was a good thing for him to be doing or a good cause for him to be supporting, but I will admit that he did do a great job at getting the message out there, and a girl's gotta appreciate that. He organized exhibits across the country in museums and at state fairs to educate the public about eugenics so that the good people would breed and the bad people wouldn't. State fairs even had contests called Fitter Families for Future Firesides, where they judged who had the best genes and who should have more children. And while these things did seem like fun and games, every heredity chart that got filled out at these fairs got added to the database in the eugenics record office. And now you may be wondering, okay, but what about those deemed unfit? What do you do with those people? Well, don't you worry, because people really thought long and hard on that one in history. The first thought was that laissez-faire policies would just kind of eliminate them from the gene pool over time, because in theory, if you don't coddle the poor, then they're just going to die off. But obviously that would take forever, so many eugenicists decided it was faster to just go with euthanasia. But then they decided that was kind of dark and people probably weren't going to like them if they did that, so instead they just decided to plan sterilization programs. Now, who was to be sterilized, you ask? Well, according to Laughlin's article in a 1921 medical journal, it is the socially inadequate classes, regardless of etiology or prognosis, are the following: feeble-minded, insane, including psychopathic, criminalistic, including the delinquent and wayward, epileptic, inebriate, including drug habitués, diseased, including tuberculosis, the syphilitic, the leprous, and others with chronic infectious segregated diseases, blind, including those with greatly impaired vision, deaf, including those with greatly impaired hearing, deformed, including the crippled, and dependent, including children and old folks in homes, ne'er-do-wells, tramps, and paupers. Now, you may notice that there's an interesting line here. A lot of these things aren't so-called mental deficiencies or disabilities, and that is true, but there was a strong belief then that if you're morally deficient, then you are mentally deficient, and vice versa. And honestly, that's still kind of a thing. Due to all of this scientific research, let's say, temporary legislation legalizing sterilization was put in place. And then there was a massive propaganda campaign to convince people that this legislation had to be made permanent, including holding a national eugenics conference to gather support. After the conference, the exhibits were packed up and sent to DC so that the congressmen had no choice but to look at them and read them and get these ideas stuck into their heads. But don't worry, it wasn't really a new concept to them. Albert Johnson, the dude in charge of US immigration affairs at the time, was a staunch believer in the cause and appointed Laughlin as the chief congressional eugenicist. We used to have a chief congressional eugenicist. Now, this was followed by Laughlin testifying before Congress with scientific reports stating that immigrants from certain countries had higher levels of feeble-mindedness in their populations. And then Calvin Coolidge signed a bill in 1924 that banned immigration from Asian countries, banned all Jews and Italians, and required IQ tests to be completed at Ellis Island, and if you failed them, you were deported. And these policies really did not change at all during World War II, when thousands of Jewish people were trying to take refuge in our country. In fact, there was actually a bill proposed to change the law so that Jewish children could come to live in foster homes in the US, but Laughlin lobbied to have that law scrapped, and he won. And what did this tell the Nazis? Well, it told them that they were doing the right thing and should keep up the good work. Now, what's interesting about all this is that at the same time, the scientific community was starting to go, wait, maybe eugenics actually makes no sense? The Great Depression showed that, maybe poverty isn't actually genetic. And a scientist named Thomas Morgan, who studied fruit fly genetics for nearly a decade and was a staunch believer in eugenics, began to realize that genetics and heredity isn't mathematical at all. It isn't one gene for one trait, and then he ended up withdrawing from the US Genetics Board. The creator of the IQ test, Henry Goddard, openly admitted that he had been wrong to create those terms, and he now knows that those individuals he saw as morons, imbeciles, and idiots were fully capable of managing their own affairs. In 1932, there was another eugenics conference, and the majority of the scientific community actually didn't attend. But did that stop Laughlin and his legislation lobbying? No. Also, that was a lot of alliteration. Wow. Anyway, so in 1927, we had a landmark case called called Buck v. Bell, and there's an excellent, excellent film I highly recommend. It's called Against Her Will, the Carrie Buck story, with a very young Marlee Matlin playing the lead. It's heartbreaking and beautiful. I'm gonna watch it after I finish filming this, and if you have these boons, I do highly recommend giving it a watch. But anyway, doctors around the country wanted some sort of example case, something that could go right up to the Supreme Court, which would then make some sort of blanket ruling legislation legalizing sterilization. And that case ended up being the poor Carrie Buck, a young woman. She was about 20 the year that this got to the Supreme Court, who was initially in foster care but was then institutionalized because she had a child out of wedlock and also without consent. And the institution wanted her to be sterilized because she was so-called feeble-minded. Buck lost at an 8-1 ruling, with Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes saying, "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough." And this ruling has never been overturned. Now, as I let that sink into your brain, let us also take a moment to realize that in this statement, a Supreme Court justice, in fact the Chief Justice, is talking about how the Supreme Court sustains rulings for compulsory vaccination. It's very interesting. Very interesting. Anyway, by the end of World War II, under state laws, at least 80,000 Americans had undergone forced sterilization. And keep in mind that at the same time, this stuff is being actively, massively debunked by scientists, to the point where eugenicists began to switch from "they can't continue their bad bloodline" as a narrative to "would they make a good parent though?" After the war, sterilizations continued, but rates diminished significantly in most states. Also, many organizations and journals ended up changing their name from eugenics to genetics to avoid any association with the Nazis. But the ideals, well, those were still there. And now we had scientific equipment to really look at cells and pieces of cells. So what can we find in every single cell that we can call a gene? What is the scientific proof of a thing that we can blame for heredity and the ills of society? Well, in 1953, the double helix was discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick, and they published this finding in a paper that very clearly states that there are connections between DNA and genes and heredity is quite the hypothesis. But people wanted genes to exist, and so they just believed it. And before you say, "Sydney, this sounds like a conspiracy theory," the first time I heard it, I also thought that until I read like 12 scientific papers and found several books, discovered that there's a whole other side of science that I've never seen before or heard of before, and now I am firmly convinced that I know absolutely nothing about anything and my brain is exploding. And for a little extra proof in this theory, James Watson was actually stripped of all of his honorary titles in 2019 because of his repeated eugenicist comments about race and intelligence. And one of the documentaries I watched included a really great clip of him standing in a gas chamber at Auschwitz just a few years ago saying that he's very frustrated because Hitler actually had the right idea, but then he went and tainted it for everybody else. And I directly quote, "Things that we might think are sensible, we can't do because people would say, well, Hitler would have done the exact same thing." So I really would not put it past this guy to just make an incredibly eugenically biased science report. We're going to get back to the science in a bit, but first let's finish up the history because while this may seem like forever ago, keep in mind that my grandparents were in elementary and middle school, if not high school. I don't know how time works, at the time that this was going on. It's recent history. President Lyndon B. Johnson entered the Oval Office and tried his dang hardest to get rid of eugenic policies. I knew absolutely nothing about this dude until this project, and I wish I learned about him in school. He did a lot. He seems like a very underrated dude. But anyway, he banned discrimination against disabled people, he reformed the immigration bills, began the war against poverty, preaching that biology is in fact not your destiny, though we all know that kind of warring against ideas is just not the move and it doesn't really work, but he actually was kind of successful. And because of all of his work towards this, people saw it as permission to begin fighting for equality, hence the massive amount of civil rights movements that were happening in that era. And in turn, these protests then created pressure for him to do even more, and then other people voted on it because it felt more like a pressing issue because there were constant protests going on. He also appointed Sergeant Shriver, who was super freaking cool. He was Johnson's director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, and he founded the Job Corps, Head Start, Vista, Upward Bound, and was behind the creation of the Peace Corps as well to give equal opportunities to everybody regardless of how they grew up. He also created the Legal Services Program, which gave lawyers to people who couldn't afford representation, which then gave people the ability to fight for fair housing and against discrimination, began adult literacy programs, healthcare programs, infrastructure, etc., etc. And under these programs, the poverty rate was cut by 40%. And this began to shift power dynamics across the country, which then the people formerly empowered didn't like, because it's almost like privileged people see equality as oppression. Where have I heard that one before? I feel like I've heard... Anyway, then we had Nixon. Yike. We don't need to go into how racist and eugenicist this man was. You can Google it, see the compilations of all the leaked tapes of him saying some really, really horrible stuff. We don't need to continue that hate here. We don't need to re-platform it. Let's just say that he supported a lot of pseudoscience. And around this time, a lot of pseudoscientific papers supporting his opinions came out, specifically around the IQ, and then he took that science to hide behind as he cut more than 50% of the funding to all of these social programs. Oh, but the one bit he did expand? Birth control for the poor. You know, for sterilizations, to fund those in 1971. Yeah. Apparently, the White House said that it was going to send out some guidelines requiring a certain age bracket, informed consent for sterilization, etc., but for some reason they were never sent out, and then found in a warehouse 2 years later. So strange. So it then became up to the discretion of doctors and nurses at the clinics, and as we talked about a few weeks back with the medical model of disability and what that can do, well, here is your proof of that, because during the Nixon administration, nearly 400,000 poor people were forcefully sterilized, and many of them didn't even know, and many of them were people of color. In 1973, a lawsuit required the federal government to issue stringent guidelines on sterilization, including a ban on sterilizing anybody under the age of 18. The suit won, but some doctors likely ignored that law anyway. The following presidents, Reagan and Clinton, continued to cite eugenicist research and cut funding to these support programs, and that's where my history of eugenics ends and the science aspect of it begins. So, let's begin with your high school biology class, where you sat down and you made your little Punnett squares showing that there are 4 outcomes a child could have with any given gene. You may have used toothpicks and colored marshmallows or jelly beans even to create a set of DNA, and then you were told that the DNA is the book of life, that it's the instruction booklet for building a human, and without it we have nothing. The DNA tells the cells what to do, the cells follow those directions to create organs and functions like cognition, and all of those things according to this blueprint that they've been given through the DNA. And it's this DNA, or the gene, that is basically the root of everything, that has the explanations for human nature and social inequality and literally everything else. But when you really think critically about that, the fact that there are only 4 nucleotides that make up DNA and that nucleotides are just passive chemicals, it makes you start to wonder if that can really be the answer to life, existence, and everything as a whole. I mean, if we share 60% of our DNA with bananas, does that mean that only 40% of those chemicals are actually in charge of all of the humanness that we possess? Like, logistically, how does that even work? And then what's interesting here is that scientists have actually been saying this exact same thing since the moment the double helix was discovered. The Human Genome Project, which was completed in 2003, was supposed to give us the answer to everything, and the thesis that scientists came up with, well, it was essentially, we know even less now than we did before. We got nothing. Also, a gene is not technically a specified thing. It's kind of an idea. Every scientist you go to will have a different definition of what a gene is. In fact, many scientists are actually starting to replace the term with DNA elements or coding sequences to separate this centuries-long idea of the omnipotent gene from the actual reality of DNA. A 2016 study showed that correlations between variant DNA sequences and trait values from genome-wide scans explain very little amounts of variance in traits, and none of these correlations have shown to be caused by DNA differences. Interesting. Evolutionary science has now shown us that animals actually existed and functioned for a long time before DNA had even evolved into existence. In the lab, scientists have created living, breathing, reproducing organisms without any genes. They feed, develop, grow, reproduce, evolve, and so on. A 2015 study showed that in a common yeast, up to 80% of its genes can be deleted without any detriment to the normal function under optimum conditions. So clearly DNA is not the blueprint for life as we know it. So then what is it? Well, it seems like rather than being the leader of the system, it's kind of the system that uses it. It's kind of like a template or a passive database that is then used by the organism to continue making proteins that it regularly requires. DNA is unique, it can be similar between family members, and it is helpful for crime solving unless you're identical twins. There's a really great legal video about that somewhere. I'll try to link it if I can find it again. But as far as studies have shown, it doesn't really control the traits that you see or that you experience. It's instead the system itself that controls these traits. The cells, their physiology, cognition, and behavior. All of these things that respond to environmental changes and use genes accordingly. Within the cell, processes are self-organized around extensive interacting signaling networks sensitive to environmental changes. Another 2015 study showed that many people can have the same physical traits, but completely different genes, and therefore critical enzymes making those physical traits appear, like we talked about in my evolution video with skin color. Basically, genetic variations really don't matter as long as they do the job. And a lot of traits seem to be genetic because they're caused by environmental factors that happen during an offspring's development, which can in turn affect development throughout life and even into subsequent generations. An example being a parent who drank a lot while they were pregnant in the past would be seen as having a defective bloodline for having a disabled child, when in fact we now know that it's as a result of the environmental factor of alcohol during its crucial development as a fetus. And studies have shown that sequences can be deliberately mutated by the body during development caused by the demands of changing environments as detected by the system. And much like choosing what font you choose to write in, it's often a very minute change to the actual big picture of everything else going on, but it is enough of a change to be a change if you look hard enough. And I will say that this argument comes dangerously close to the somebody messed up in your bloodline and now everybody's autistic. Or alternatively, if we stop the pregnant person from doing / experiencing a certain thing while pregnant, we can stop autistic development, which is a big yikes. And there is some research that kind of supports this, just like a wee bit, which is even more of a yikes. But I feel like I have to say all of the science that I researched and not pick and choose based on what I think could be used for good and for bad. A lot of science can be used for bad. Should I trust humanity to know that for themselves? No, I really, really shouldn't. But do I really want to? Yes, I do. There's also an interesting discussion to be had here about the use of twin studies, where psychologists show that if there is more statistical correlation between identical twins versus between fraternal twins, that said thing is due to biological factors. Because obviously identical twins share the same DNA, which then assumes that the environments of identical twins and fraternal twins are the same, which that assumption isn't really true. Identical twins look more alike, they're treated more alike, they're socialized to be more similar, they have a much stronger emotional bond to each other than fraternal twins do, and we can see that in studies. They're more likely to see themselves as two halves of the same whole. So it would make sense that they would be significantly more similar in their behavior and abilities and even mental illnesses than fraternal twins, for reasons having absolutely nothing to do with genetics at all. In general, there is no way to truly measure anything in regards to genetic predisposition. Every person experiences every part of their life completely differently. They change over time, and remember that life is traumatizing for everybody. Nobody gets out of this unscathed. We are all complicated beings, and simple biology cannot easily explain anything. So now the big question is, why? Why did it take me a random documentary and several frantic JSTOR searches to learn about this despite taking so many science classes throughout my life? Why is this narrative of DNA being the answer to life shoved down our throats so hard if there's so much research to disprove it? And let's take a moment to think about the sheer amount of research that exists right now scientifically affirming queerness and gender nonconformity and transness, and about the positives of autism and the positives of screen time and social media, or the positives of immigration, and how you only find these things if you directly look for it or if somebody else looked for it and put it on a blog or an Instagram post for you to read. What do those things have in common? Well, they challenge the accepted norm created by the oppressors, which I know it sounds like a really cheesy social justice warrior whatever thing to say, but it is true. I mean, admitting that power isn't based on having good and pure blood, that men aren't genetically evolved to be aggressive hunters and should therefore be businessmen and CEOs, and women aren't genetically involved to be homemakers and carers and should stay at home, or that poor people are poor because they're meant to be that way. Admitting that all men are created equal is actually scientifically true, and that a person in power maybe did have some privilege from day one, and that other people aren't actually less than them, well, that means that you're responsible for the fact that poverty and racism and homophobia and sexism and all of these other things still exist in our world. And it means that you actually have to do work to change yourself in your community. I mean, blaming it all on biology is super easy. It means you can just step away and go, hey, science says it's because you're defective, so Sorry about that one, rather than putting actual supports in place that everyone can succeed by. I mean, this theory shows that if you get childhood right, if you get society right, all people will thrive equally. And we know that personality traits and actions have nothing to do with our genes. We know that this is a fact, and that has huge political ramifications. People in power don't want to lose power. We know this to be true, and so they prefer to believe that other people are less than them, rather than this more scientifically accurate equity and equality model of understanding humanity. And you can actually see this happening through legislation time and time again. I mean, think about Trump's immigration policies. Think about Reagan's myth of the welfare queen who's just gaming the system to get by. Think about why people still get sterilized to this day. It's because of this. And there was a really interesting example of this in a 2009 suit where a boy got lead poisoning from paint in his home and it caused brain damage. And he lost the suit because of baseless eugenic defenses, going through the report cards of everybody in his family and saying that they weren't going to amount to anything anyway. And these companies have used this defense time and time again and won every single one of their cases. And this kind of thing still goes on all of the time. I mean, look at how the CDC is handling the pandemic. Now, before we get into the today aspects of this video, let us all be honest with ourselves about the first thing that came to our minds when we just learned that DNA is not what we think it is. Let's all say it together: designer babies. For years, there has been this entire panic about how soon the rich and famous are going to be able to genetically modify their own children to look a certain way thanks to the CRISPR technology, and that the gap between the rich and the not rich is just going to get even larger and larger, and all of that nice fear-mongering stuff that we love to see in the news and media. And I think that we've all had some sort of debate about the scenario in at least one science class in either high school or college. But good news for you, most scientists say that designer babies will literally never be a possibility because that's not how DNA, it's not how DNA works. Sure, we can change DNA, we can insert the glow gene from one jellyfish into cats to make the cats glow, but guess what? Scientists don't entirely know what was going on there. They just kind of kept slicing the DNA until they found the bit that literally glowed, and then they shoved it into another animal's DNA, and then the animal glowed, which sounds super ethical, wow. But anyway, in general, scientists can genetically modify your baby. Sure, in the same way that I can get a puppy from Chernobyl and then study what radiation did to it, but we will never be able to be sure of the outcome of such a genetic change or have literally any control over it enough to make a designer baby. So you can argue about CRISPR, but it's probably not going to have the eugenic consequences that every AP bio teacher wants you to think that it will. Now, my next question was, wait, so if we can't tell anything from the sequence of a genome, how does 23andMe work? Because at least with my family, it's pretty darn accurate about a lot of things. And boy, did that open up a whole other rabbit hole of information. So let's do a mini info dump on this one too. So as we talked about earlier, we can't tell anything specific from DNA, but we can notice similarities in DNA. Well, we can't. A computer algorithm can, however. So if you put 300 people's DNA sequences into a database and 5 of them were siblings, the computer can pull out which 5 of those siblings are pretty darn quickly, especially because the more that this algorithm works, the more that it's learning and the faster it's getting, because computers are really freaky like that. But that is the algorithm that found the mitochondrial Eve that's been used for a lot of studies, and anthropologists have been using this algorithm to study how populations from different regions moved and intermixed with other populations. It's actually kind of cool. It was also used to find similarities in the DNA of people with Parkinson's disease or certain cancers. Also, 23andMe specifically discovered the genetic tag for autosomal dominant compelling helioophthalmic outburst syndrome. That's better known as a CHO syndrome, where looking at a bright light makes you sneeze. Yes, I just do have a sense of humor, and yes, that's really funny. But what are the issues with this? Well, if you get a 23andMe test, it could come back with results telling you that you have a specific variant of a specific gene mutation that makes you 3 times more likely to develop Parkinson's disease. Which, panic moment, right? I mean, you're 3 times more likely to get Parkinson's? Well, what they don't tell you is that the average risk of Parkinson's is 0.3%, so now your risk is 1%. So you are still very unlikely to get Parkinson's disease. Alternatively, you could have 6 generations of people having the disease and do a 23andMe test to find that you're not actually at risk for it. So you think, cheers, I'm all good to go, when the Parkinson's in your family is actually caused by a different genetic variant from the one that is tested by 23andMe. And this also goes for tests for Alzheimer's and breast cancer and many other things through the 23andMe program, where the risk is likely more non-genetic or from different genes than the one that it tests for. Also, much of the reason that we see it to be so accurate in locating where our ancestors are from is because of the questions that the company asks and the database that is being built up. Which means that if your ancestors are European, for example, they can tell you basically what specific Scandinavian country your family is from. But then if your ancestors are from Africa or Asia or parts of South America, it's often completely incorrect. It's getting better, but it's often blatantly wrong because they just don't have enough data. So that's interesting in its own right. But overall, the diagnoses are getting more accurate and specific in general because more and more people are doing this. But remember that it's not scientists being like, oh yes, a difference in this specific gene causes this thing. It's a computer going, everybody with this trait seems to have this same general sequence in common, so you might also have it too, when the actual cause could be something completely and totally different. And it likely is. And then there's the question of, okay, but what's the point? What are they doing with this data? Because clearly they're collecting our genetic data, and that's freaky. And that's where you need to pay attention, because the company is gathering everybody's genetic data and storing it, kind of like the Eugenics Record Office did in the early 1900s. Except this time it's actually kind of accurate a little bit. And while 23andMe says that they will never sell your data to third parties without your permission, Google also used to say that, and then they worded their privacy policy in just a specific way that made you basically agree to having all of your data sold to third parties without realizing it. So we know that this is not a very trustworthy promise for them to make. And think of all of the companies who would want this kind of data. Life insurance, disability insurance, and long-term care insurance companies, which actually are already allowed to request genetic testing as part of their application process if you've had it done, would love to have access to this data so that they can raise the rates for so-called high-risk people. And China has also been using a very similar technology to identify, track, oppress, and incarcerate the Uyghur population. So we already know that it is being used for very, very bad things. And if you've been following 23andMe since the beginning, you may have noticed that their marketing and their advertising has begun to shift from like, fun thing to know where you're from, to know about your health in that direction. And the CEO has openly said that they hope to find the causes of cancer and Parkinson's and many other diseases. Even though the science, again, shows that the genes that we have in our body, the majority of the time, do not dictate at all what our traits look like or what our experiences are. And if this weren't super creepy and dystopian, it would actually be quite an interesting discussion, but it's kind of creepy. And you've probably guessed this by now, but there really is not. There's like no regulations, more or less, for these kinds of tests. The FDA has approved the sale of these kits because they deem them to be a somewhat safe and effective medical device, but they haven't addressed the real issue of what the company should be allowed to do with all of the private health data that it has been collecting. So anyway, that's a nice segue into the topic of what eugenics looks like today. Because in case you cannot tell, it did not die in the early 1900s, it just changed its name and kept on going at full speed. And I'm beginning to realize that a lot like internalized ableism and internalized sexism and racism, etc., that we all have some sort of internalized eugenicism too. I mean, the amount of disabled people that I know who have openly thought to themselves, I shouldn't have kids because my genes are messed up, is a lot of us. And I just want to let you know that this is your message, that your genes are not messed up and you should have kids and you would make a really great parent. It also does not help that I have had several doctors tell me not to have children to my face. But anyway, in addition to that whole mess, disabled people still, the majority of the time, cannot adopt and are often unable to marry either, and their children are so often taken away from them because they are seen as unfit parents. Which is a whole other issue that we're going to make a video about at some point, but I don't have the energy to research that one right now because I researched all of this. IQ tests are obviously still around, but they have changed a little bit, and now also the SAT exists, which is a glorified IQ test. And in the US and in much of the world, people living below the poverty line are dying at the same rates as other causes of death, simply because they are poor. Also, many people think, thank goodness we don't deal with forced sterilization anymore, without realizing that it was still happening in California prisons until it was banned in 2014, that Buck v. Bell still hasn't been overturned, and that it is still disgustingly easy to sterilize somebody. A lawyer named Mark Bold, who is actively working to end eugenicist legislation and seek reparations for those affected by it, called his county clerk's office pretending that he had a disabled daughter to see how easy it would be to get her sterilized against her will. And I won't read the whole interaction for the sake of time because we're pretty far into this video, but I have included a link to it in the description, and the woman on the phone was literally just kind of like, Yeah, no, you have to do these two things, and I'll just take care of everything else. Don't you worry about it. No, don't worry, you're not the first one to do this. This has to be done. You're doing the right thing. It's what you're supposed to do. It's your obligation. In like the last 3 years. So that's just delightful. I also found some lovely articles, one from Insider in November of 2019, titled Elon Musk said his AI brain chip company could solve autism and schizophrenia, which is not how science works, but sure. Also one from the BBC in September of 2021 called Early Baby Therapy Could Reduce Autism Diagnosis, another 2021 article titled Autism Tsunami, The Impact of Rising Prevalence on the Societal Cost of Autism in the United States. And where's that one from? I mean, a fear-mongering CNN health article? No, it's in the 2021 peer-reviewed journal of the widely renowned Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, and it directly calls autistic people burdens to their family and society as a whole because our existence doesn't approve the economic system under capitalism. So at this point, it shouldn't be surprising that people with developmental disabilities are the most likely of any group to be killed by their parents and caregivers. According to the Ruderman Family Foundation report, at least one disabled person is killed per week by their parent or caregiver. And most of the time, these people do not go to jail for murdering these people because it's seen as a mercy killing and it's fine, rather than, I don't know, murder, because it's murder. Let us all remind ourselves that Autism Speaks also completely openly supports this, so. And I don't think that people look at a disabled person and genuinely think, wow, I really wish they were dead. But I do very much think that everybody has been socialized to feel intensely uncomfortable around the existence of disability. And our society is so individualistic that anything that makes us feel uncomfortable or is inconvenient to us is something that we generally want to rid ourselves of. But that's changing now. You may think to yourself, the disability movement is making disability less taboo and people are more okay with it. And that is true. It is doing that and it is doing a lot. But in the scheme of ending eugenic practices, it's moving pretty darn slowly. Let's look at another example, shall we? Prenatal screenings. So prenatal screenings became a thing because of Tay-Sachs syndrome, a rare disorder that destroys nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord and leads to very early death. It was more prominent in Jewish communities because the gene is more prominent there, and if two parents carried the gene, there was a 1 in 4 chance that their children would have this disorder. In 1971, a test was created to see if you were a carrier, and the Jewish community centers and synagogues began offering these tests, and it was really a community project. And now Tay-Sachs syndrome is virtually eradicated. And this is really great because it spares families and children from unnecessary suffering. And that testing has also now expanded to looking for other disorders like Down syndrome. Most tests for Down syndrome are typically completely correct, and it is estimated that about 2/3 of pregnancies that receive a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome are terminated. There's a discussion to be had about whether or not having Down syndrome is considered unnecessary suffering on a family and on the child involved and on how ableist that idea may be. We don't really need to go into that right now because I think you know what the sides of this argument are, and I think you can have it in your own head. But what I didn't know until I saw a recent New York Times article is that there are now tons of tests for tons of different genetic defects and subsequent super rare disorders. And there are very few restrictions or qualifications on these tests. And a lot of brochures about these tests that are given to the parents who test positive for any of these things don't really talk about how the majority of them are wrong anywhere from 74 to 94% of the time. Most of them are wrong over 90% of the time. I mean, sure, they may be correct to notice a microdeletion in a certain sequence, but the chances of that child having that super rare disorder associated with it are still very incredibly rare. Not to mention that with some of these syndromes, like Turner syndrome, for example, you live a completely normal life despite having some heart defects and being infertile. And also, that test is wrong 74% of the time. It's expected that patients will pursue follow-up testing after a positive result, but these are often tests that can cost thousands of dollars and can't be performed until after the abortion window in many states. And there's a knee-jerk reaction of, well, if it weren't bad, then why would they test me for it in the first place? So many people just end their pregnancies completely unnecessarily solely due to some genetic testing companies trying to turn a profit. Also, much like with 23andMe, just because you test negative for a disorder does not mean that the child does not have one, because genes are not the end-all and be-all of anything. So this is a whole tricky eugenicist mess. And again, the disability movement is trying to reframe things, saying that some disabilities are a superpower, insert really bad segue into talking about Temple Grandin, the person who everybody asks if I know about, just after asking my opinion on Atypical once they learn that I am autistic. Because those are the only two things anybody's heard of. I lovingly refer to her as the Betty Friedan of the autism movement because she made a big step, she started a conversation, she did some great stuff, but boy is she not intersectional, and if she could just scoot out of the way to make room for, non-eugenicist autism advocates, that would be just so incredibly lovely. But anyway, Dr. Temple Grandin did do a good deal for our community. She is the first and kind of the only famous autistic person, and she was late diagnosed. She grew up in the era of autism is caused by bad parenting, and she helped to dispel a lot of stereotypes about autistic people, including the misconception that we are completely incapable of receiving an education because she is a doctor in animal science. Her advocacy led to the use of service and therapy animals with autistic and disabled people, which is pretty cool, and she definitely paved a way for us. But also, everything she says is taken as gospel by the world and generalized to apply to every single autistic human on Earth. And she has openly said that she thinks that high-functioning autistics should be treasured and continue to exist, while low-functioning autistics should be prevented from existing in the future. Yay! She's literally quoted as saying, "In an ideal world, the scientist should find a method to prevent the most severe forms of autism, but allow the milder forms to survive." She also supports ABA, or autism conversion therapy, believes that over time you become less and less autistic, which is just not how that works, because if anything, I've become way more autistic over time. And also just no. She's yelled at young autistic adults who don't have jobs, saying that they are burdens on society. She's also claimed that she doesn't see autism advocacy as a real job, which is really funny considering, her job as an autism advocate. And she believes that autistic people who are not fully independent are the results of their parents babying them and therefore failing society. So, in thesis, yes, I can talk to animals, and so can Temple Grandin, but if you could stop comparing me to an old white eugenicist woman who tries to make disability palatable to the general public by just erasing the majority of disability from existence, I would very much appreciate it. And this is also why the whole autism is a superpower movement is not great, because it classifies the good and the bad of autism, and it fits within this eugenicist framework. I have a video about that. It is over here. It's over here? Yeah, I know where sides are. Now, speaking of white privilege, these transitions are getting exponentially worse. Oh my goodness. We're almost done. We're getting there. Anyway, speaking of white privilege, let's talk about COVID in the United States, because if I did not include our train wreck of a pandemic response into my video about eugenics, what would even be the point of making this video? Why would I even bother to do that? So let's begin with the CDC director, Dr. Walensky's comments on Good Morning America on January 7th.
Given that, is it time to start rethinking how we're living with this virus, that it's potentially here to stay?
Really important study, if I may just summarize it, a study of 1.2 million people who were vaccinated between December and October. The overwhelming number of deaths, over 75%, occurred in people who had at least 4 comorbidities. So really these are people who were unwell to begin with. And yes, really encouraging news in the context of Omicron.
Okay, well, let's unpack this statement. And before you say, Sydney, you took that clip out of context just like everybody else did everywhere, I did watch the whole interview. The context of the clip does not really help in any sort of way at all. So first of all, 30 million Americans live with 5 or more comorbidities. So that's just about 10% of the population. And so yes, it is really encouraging that 10% of the population is dying. Let us just do 0 measures to stop that. And also 37% of US adults are at serious risk for severe illness, regardless of what variant, and the vast majority of people have at least one comorbidity when they contract COVID. Second of all, unwell to begin with. Cool. So having multiple comorbidities does not mean that you're on death's door. For example, a pregnant person with face blindness, nearsightedness, autism, and irritable bowel syndrome technically has 5 comorbidities, but they are functionally completely fine as long as they wear glasses and don't eat too many beans and go to the doctor for the baby that's inside of them. That is not a reasonable COVID death. Not to mention that the idea of a reasonable COVID death is also completely horrible, and the idea that, oh, this disease only really affects old people and vulnerable people, so let's not change how we live our lives, is so incredibly messed up. Oh my goodness. Even the idea of, we're all gonna get COVID anyway, is also a major issue. And there have been some arguments about separating comorbidities into like the life-threatening ones and the less life-threatening ones, but again, whether it's having mental illness or having cystic fibrosis, the type of comorbidity that you have should not determine a person's value and right to live over another person's value and right to live. And when it comes to triaging in hospitals, which is choosing who gets care and who doesn't, the focus is on people who are more likely to survive rather than first come, first serve. And autistic people are on the non-consensual do not resuscitate list, just because they're autistic, so that's really fun. Also, the pandemic is a mass disabling event, so many people who survive COVID will end up with several comorbidities after developing COVID. So to clarify, these people deserved care to survive, but now that they've survived, they no longer deserve the care, which is an interesting situation. And due to the structures of society, having several comorbidities is significantly more common in communities of color. So, in conclusion, the CDC is pretty darn chill with the deaths of millions of disabled people and people of color in order to keep our economy going, which, logically, if you don't protect your citizens for the sake of the economy, they're all going to die, and then there will be no economy because they can't buy things if they're dead. Logically. But sure, whatever, do what you will. Obviously, there is no perfectly right answer here that's going to make everybody happy. That simply doesn't exist. And triaging itself is a very difficult situation as well. But I think that if we could all do our part to make hospitals not look like a war zone, I think we wouldn't have as many of these conversations on who lives and who dies. And please don't quote Hamilton. I know that the end of that sentence sounded like it. Now, in conclusion, to this marathon of a video, which is probably the longest video I will ever make, please, there was just so much info that I couldn't really split it up. So what can you do? How can you fight the system to make it a better place for everyone and fight your own internal biases? Well, first of all, just by being here and watching my videos, you are taking a really big step. Learning from disabled people, learning about disabled people, exposing yourself to disabled narratives, all of that is really, really important. And call out other people when they promote ableist and eugenicist ideas, and realize that it's often because they just genuinely have no idea. Recognize that everybody deserves to live a full and a happy life as an equal human being. Nobody is better than anybody else. Fight for equal rights and just use your brain, wear a mask, get tested, be smart about your COVID safety, and your germ safety in general. Overall, I ask that you think critically, because what we've learned today is that people wanted to find hard facts to support their own personal opinions and points of view, and they still do that. So do your best to take stock of what your biases are, try to see every single side of the story, and then look under the nearest rock and see what else you can find. What narratives aren't you seeing? Why aren't you seeing those narratives? Why do the comments of the CDC make you feel uncomfortable? And what can you do about those things to make your community a better place for everybody who's a part of it? Maybe that was too many questions. Maybe I'm showing that I'm very Quaker. But please reflect upon those things. Focus on the little things to see what you can do in the face of big systems that are hard to fight, and be the best world citizen that you can possibly be, because if we're all the best world citizens, that's gonna do a whole lot. So let me know what your experiences are with eugenics in the comment. Let me know what kinds of resources exist, what you're gonna do. I'm going to link everything that I read as well as further videos and readings and whatnot in the description. And I also want to give a quick, speedy shout out to my friend Mickey Rose's book, Fiercely Different, because I got a lot of my ideas and sources and stuff from that. I did a reread for this project. It's an incredible read. I have a pre-release copy. Please go pre-order it. It's stunning. But anyway, that is all for today. I hope that you learned as much as I did. If you want a lighter, more positive watch, you can check out my Wednesday video about the autism of Cinderella. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, your story isn't over. It is only just begun. It is always okay to change your mind when you learn new stuff. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.